Last year, I analyzed every single Title Tuesday tournament of 2023. The video was over an hour long, but did surprisingly well. So when 2024 brought an additional Tuesday and even more tournaments, I knew I had to do it again. But this time, I wanted to make it better, which means more analysis and results in a much shorter time. And I even created something new, an interactive chart, to answer some of last year's comments and something you can explore by yourself. The R script and raw data are still available on GitHub if you're interested in doing your own analysis. For that, I recommend to watch last year's video for more detailed code explanations. Here's a quick look at what we're going to cover in the next 40 minutes. First player and then tournament specific results. And near the end, we dive into advanced principal component analysis to separate grandmasters based on 15 different variables. This video is all about results, patterns, and what data tells us about elite chess players. Ready for the opening move/analysis? Then let's go. Let's start with the obvious question: who was the most successful player of 2024? And that title goes of course to Hikaru Nakamura, who entered 93 Title Tuesday tournaments, winning 22 of them, which gave him a win rate of 23.7%. Only Magnus comes close to that with 13 wins in fewer participations, also with a very high win rate of almost 23%. And then you have all these other elite GMs that won at least twice in 2024, but of course with a much lower win rate. We can compare that to the 2023 results. Both Nakamura and Carlsen won 4 more tournaments compared to 2023. And in 2023, Dmitry Andreikin was the third best player with 6 wins. Last year, he only got 2 wins, even though he participated a lot. And the third best player in 2024 was Alireza Firouzja. Here are the other players that could win the tournament in 2024, sorted by their number of participations. So the fewer trials, the higher your win rate. As you can see, all of them are GMs. And then there's one FIDE master who won it in 69 tries, Reza Mahdavi. So all in all, 39 players managed to get a win in 2024 in the 106 tournaments in 2024. The Title Tuesday tournaments are priced events. Chess.com pays $5,000 every Tuesday. And if you win a lot of tournaments or are placed at least in the top 5, you earn a portion of that prize pool. And in 2024, Hikaru earned $34,350 in his 93 attempts at the tournament. And here you can see the top 25 with regards to the earning of prize money. We can turn it into a chart to see how much more Hikaru won compared to the other players. You get this skewed distribution, with most players earning less than $5,000 or $10,000, and then just a handful break through this barrier. And even if we normalize this by the number of participations, so the attempts they had, you see Magnus earning more per tournament he participates than Hikaru Nakamura. Both are close to $400, and then the other players are below $200 and then even below $100. And as I said, the first 5 places get a prize money. So here the players are sorted by the number of times they made it into the money, with their median place attached. So Hikaru and Carlsen, over 50% of the times they participate, they actually make it into the top 5, which is really unusual. There's only one other player that makes it into the top 10 reliably. Here's the rest of the top 25 with regards to their top 5 placements. But even then, some of these players did not even win the tournament in their many attempts, like for example Fabiano Caruana. And you remember there were 39 players that won the tournament, but there are of course more that placed in the top 5 at least 3 times or more. And here I just listed the top 50. Next, we can look at the highest average score of players that participated at least 5 times in this tournament. Again, you find Hikaru Nakamura and Magnus Carlsen with 8.9 and 8.65 points per tournament, where you of course play 11 rounds, so the maximum score you can get is 11 points, and Magnus Carlsen got that in 2024 one time. There were 15 players that got a score of 8 points or better. Again, I show the top 25 players, and what you can see is that they not always play all of the 11 games, so the more games you play, the more points you can earn. And that means that the average score of Hikaru, when he only plays 10.75 games per tournament, comes down to 0.826 points per game. Magnus Carlsen is slightly better with 0.836 points per game. This is the plot that shows the more games you play, then overall the more points you make on average, and grandmasters have a much steeper slope than international masters and FIDE masters. which of course makes sense because the average scores not only relate to the games you play, but also your rating. Here you can see that for most titles, the higher your rating, the bigger your score. But the Grandmasters stand out that they only begin at a certain rating and then their slope is steeper again. And last time someone asked me which players I showed in the thumbnail. And of course here Hikaru Nakamura and Magnus Carlsen are in the top right corner with their average scores, best rating and tournament participation, also the prize money and their username. So I created this interactive chart on Flourish, and here you can filter by title and then investigate the other players. If you are above the line, that means you make usually more points than the rating suggests, and you can see that the size of the dot represents the number of tournaments you play. So Garakamsky participated 102 times, and usually if you play more tournaments, you learn to make more points. So smaller circles below the line. I share the link in the description. You can investigate the rating and average points of these players and other titles like International Masters, which ones stand out with their average points and ratings. I remember one FIDE master, Reza Mahdavi, very high rated. He actually won the tournament once. Now that we saw the average scores, what is the score you actually need to win? And here you can see if you get the perfect score of 11, of course you win, 10.5 also, but most wins were accomplished by 10 points or 9.5 points. If you look into the difference between early and late tournaments, the median and mean are identical, but in the early tournaments, more wins happen with the 10 points compared to the late ones, where you could win with 9.5 points a bit more often. The second place, so the person you would have to beat to win a tournament, at least has 9 points, median 9.5, average really close by, sometimes the second place even at 10 or 10.5 points. For the top 8 players, I created this chart to show what score they had when they won the tournament. So Hikaru, pretty balanced, 10 points most of the time, sometimes 9.5, sometimes 10.5. Magnus with the perfect score one time, winning with 11, but very similar proportions. Jan-Christoph Duda won with 9.5 and 10 points. And here are all the other players winning, again, most of the time with 10 or 9.5 points. The only 2 players who got a perfect score in 2024 were Magnus Carlsen and Jose Martinez. Both in August, the late tournament, they managed to get 11 out of 11 points, so they won each and every game. In 2023, Hikaru did accomplish that with Magnus Carlsen, so it's really rare to win every game in this tournament. Another thing that's really hard to accomplish, but not as unlikely as the perfect score, is something that's called sweeping the day, where you win the early and the late tournament. In 2024, only Hikaru Nakamura managed to do that, and he did it 3 times. So you can see in April he won the early tournament with 10 points, and then the late tournament with 10 points again. The first was a tiebreaker, as was the early tournament in May 2024, and then he also won the late tournament, and a third time in November with 10 points and 2 very close tiebreakers, beating Furusha and Sarana. In 2023, sweeping the day was a little bit more common. 6 different players accomplished that feat. You can also ask how often a player even had the chance to winning both tournaments. And here you can see that Hikaru Nakamura participated both early and late 42 times, Magnus Carlsen only 17 times, Arjun Aragaisi 13, Jeffrey Xiong 35. Why do I bring up these names? It's because they came close to sweeping the day, as did Hikaru Nakamura. He placed second in the early tournament and then won the late one. Aragaisi placed second both early and late, but he had the same points as Hikaru and Andrekin, who won the tournaments. Magnus Carlsen came close in August, where he placed second early and late. Hikaru in November won the early tournament and then placed second in the late tournament. And around Christmas, December 24, Magnus won the early tournament and then placed second in the late one. And this tournament we can look at because Reza Mahdavi, who was only 16 years at that time, won the tournament, and in round 8 he managed to get a draw with the white pieces against Carlsen, and then won the tiebreaker with a Buchholz cut of 75 versus 70. So that was Magnus Carlsen's last chance to sweep the day. The next analysis is about the most active players. Here you have Mikhail Golubev, who participated in all 106 Title Tuesday tournaments, and he played each and every game. And then you have 3 more Grandmasters that participated 100 or more times. I also list their best rating, and this is the table of the top 25 players with regards to tournament participations. Some play only a few games when they join, but most of these play all of the games, which can also then lead to a really long participation streak. Of course, if you play every tournament, then your streak is 106. But some players had a break in between, yet Karakamsky participated at 79 tournaments in a row. Last year, Sergei Zigalko had the most tournament participations and the longest streak, but Golubev was already very strong in 2023. When we look at the most active players, we can dig a little bit deeper into the number of games played. So here are the top 25 again with regards to games played in total in 2024. Golubev being the only one that played all of the games. And then you can see the best rating and best place. Karakamsky managed to get 4th place. Alexander Bordnik winning some tournaments. Hikaru Nakamura, of course, being very active, playing 1,000 games. And then you have some players that play a lot, but did not manage to place in the top 100. For example, Marcel Winkels, a Dutch candidate master born in 1964, still participating in many tournaments and playing a lot of games. And naturally, when we look at many games being played, we can ask who won the most games. And here we have Hikaru Nakamura. You remember he played 1,000 games, winning 753 of them, gives you an overall win rate of 75.3%. Magnus Carlsen is not in the top 25 in this table, but I show a few more entries. He is 28th, just because he didn't play as many games as the other players, but win rate related, he's still very much top. In this table, you could sort by win rate and then get 8 players that are above 70% win rate overall. And just for completion, here are the other top 50 players that got the most wins in 2024 Title Tuesday tournaments. We can also show the table with the most losses, which for once shows the dedication that some of these players have, participating week after week, giving the best. And here I just show the whole table in a different browser where we can sort a little bit. I show the top 25 players with regard to losing games in total. You still have their rating, the best plays, and then the median and max score. So some players actually got a respectable average score of 6 to 5 points, sometimes max even 8 and 7.5 points, which gave them the best placement around 25 to 50. So you see it's a highly competitive field, and losing there is still respectable. A bit more fun is the number of draws and drawing percentages. There is one player who draws 1 in 4 games, David Paravian from Russia. Karakamsky also drawing above 20%. Alexander Goryashkina, female grandmaster from Russia, placed 7 here. And just for completion, 25 more players, all sorted by total number of draws they got in 2024. But let's get back to winning. Here you have the average and max winning streaks by the different titles. So everyone but the grandmasters establish a winning streak around 3 games on average and median. Just the grandmasters stand out by having 5 games on average that they win in a row, with one max value being 18. And this came of course from Magnus Carlsen. Here are the top 25 players with regard to winning streak. Magnus Carlsen and Nakamura, 18 and 14 games. And then 2 players with 13 games that they could win in a row, and more with 12 and 11. Magnus Carlsen did establish his winning streak around his perfect game, which happened in the late tournament of August the 6th. And here you can see that he won every game of the 11 rounds. And then he managed to win 7 more games in the next tournament, which was the early tournament of August 13th. And his winning streak just ended because he drew a game with black against the person that later won the tournament. And that player was Jose Martinez. And Jose Martinez was the player who also got a perfect score in 2024, but he did not use that to get his long winning streak. He got his 12-game winning streak by winning round 3 to 11 of the early tournament, and then 3 more games of the late tournament, and then he only got a draw with the white pieces. And Nakamura got his 14 games winning streak on January 30 by winning round 6 to 11 in the early, and then 1 to 8 in the late tournament. And then his winning streak ended because he lost with the white pieces against the later winner, which in this case was Hans Niemann. This brings us to the top performers by their winning percentage, and this is overall, so regardless of the white or the black pieces. Here you have the percentage of winning overall of the top 25 players. And one thing to mention here is that David Howell, Grandmaster from Great Britain, often misses the first games and then faces a much softer competition. That explains the high winning percentage, and that's the reason that for the next analysis where I look into white pieces and black pieces, I exclude him from the top 25. So we start with the top 25 players that have the highest winning percentage with white. We filter by at least 50 games played with that color, and we see Magnus Carlsen wins 82%, Sam Sevian and Hikaru Nakamura also above 80% with at least 70 or here even 500 games with the white pieces. Really strong players. Here's the rest of the top 25, and that's really strong performance by these players. We have the same result with the black pieces. Now of course you don't get above 80% anymore. Magnus Carlsen is leading again. Then you have Jan-Christoph Duda, Ali Reza Firouzja, some more players that get 70% done. Hikaru Nakamura, here only 11th place, but he also played the most games, so it's possible that some of these percentages would come down in the long run. The second half of the table shows these grandmasters and Renato Terry, the only international master from Peru that breaks into the top 25 with the winning percentage of black pieces. I find it also interesting to look into how hard are you to beat with the white pieces. So now we're looking at the losing percent with white, and the lower the better. And here Hikaru Nakamura shows that it's almost impossible to beat him. He only loses 6.6% of the games. When he has the white pieces, the only other single digit player is Magnus Carlsen, and then some players, Sam Sevian, Hans Niemann, Dennis Lazovic, that are around 11 and 12%. Here are the top 25. So with the white pieces, they lose 15% or less of their games. How does it look with the black pieces? And here Maxime from France is in the lead with 90 games played with black. He only lost 11% of them. Magnus Carlsen and Nakamura, second and third place with more games, but still 2% different, nothing to be ignored. The rest of the 25, here losing 20% or above, is still really strong. You're starting to get a feeling about who the strongest players are in this field. Next we can ask, what is the average competition rating they still manage to beat? And here you can see that Magnus Carlsen won 240 games with the white pieces, and on average his players were rated 2,865 and the median opponent rating was 2,909. That means that all of the players that he beat with the white pieces, 50% of them were stronger than 2,909 and 50% were weaker or lower rated than 2,909. And this is one of the rare exceptions that the median is actually higher than the average. So it's a left scoot distribution, and that comes from the fact that in the early rounds, each of these players gets an opponent on random, which can then by default be lower rated, so 1500 or 1800. And then once they beat them and accumulate more points, they are matched against other players with similar points, which of course are then also higher rated. And that's why the average is dragged down or skewed to the left by the earlier opponents with lower ratings. And here you have the top 25 and the average competition they are able to beat with the white pieces. We can do the same for the black pieces, and now Magnus Carlsen is only third place. Hikaru Nakamura on average beats a competition of 2,900. And here's the second half of the table showing you the top 25 players and the average rating they're able to beat with the black pieces. Next we can look at some exceptional players, because these are the lowest rated players that could win the tournament. So most of the winners are rated above 3,000. Here are some that are rated only quote-unquote 2,800 and above. Kasper Pioren participated 12 times, and with a score of 10 in the early tournament of February 6, he managed to win. Vladislav Kovalev took 69 attempts, and one of them he won in May 21, the early tournament, also with 10 points. But with a rating below 2,844, no other player managed to win. And you can see that all of these are grandmasters. The only non-grandmaster to win the tournament was Reza Mahdavi. As I said, 16-year-old FIDE master from Iran. He managed to beat Magnus Carlsen in December 24 in the late tournament, where Carlsen was about to sweep the day after winning the early tournament, but then he only placed second behind this 16-year-old prodigy. and all the other non-grandmasters, the best rank or place that they achieved during 2024 was 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th places. So for non-GMs it's still possible to earn some prize money. And you can see Reza again, Renato Terry from Peru, we saw placing in the top 5 often, but usually this field is for the grandmasters only. Another thing that's happening in parallel to the Title Tuesday tournaments is the Titled Cup, which gives extra money to the top 10 women, juniors and seniors and the top 5 girls, and then there's an open category with even higher prize money. And the way this works is that your top 20 results from the year are counted and added up, and then they see the top 10 players. This is the open category, and I wanted to analyze the women, seniors, juniors and girls in more detail. So let's start with the women. I took the usernames of the top 15 women. You can see it's really close on the top between these 2 or even 6 contestants. Here you have the best scores that went into the overall score. And what I did now is I added a few more variables to compare them. This is sorted by the average score that they had. So Kostyniuk ahead of Goryanchkina, Mary Arabadze, international master from Georgia, 6.11, and so on. I have their best rating, so we can sort by the highest rating and then see that some players with a high rating did not so good on scores, partially because they did not play all the games. We can sort by number of participations, the winning streak they managed to establish, and then also their winning percentages. Kostyniuk best with the white pieces, but only 7th place with the black pieces. And then I also have the average opponent rating that they defeated. And when we sort by that, Kostyniuk is ahead again of Goryashkina, which means that for 2024, the average score pretty much represents quite well who the best women player was. Moving on to the seniors leaderboard. These are players that were born in 1974 or earlier. And here there's a clear winner, Gata Kamsky, the only one who made it into the prize money in 2024. Nonetheless, I took the top 15 players and added some extra analysis. As you can see by the average score, Gata Kamsky almost 1 point ahead of the 2nd place, Alexander Rustemov. We have the best rating, number of participations, so these are players that just enjoy the game so much that they play a lot and they are still really strong. Gata Kamsky even got a 10 games winning streak. He wins with the white pieces 67% of the time. Only Rodrigo Vasquez is a bit stronger. As I said, Gata Kamsky was the only one that won the prize money with his best place, which was number 4. The other top 15 usually plays around 10 to 40. And then we also have the winning percentage with black, above 50% for the top 4. And then the competition that they are still able to beat on average is a 2,600. We continue with the juniors category. These are players that are born 2006 or later, so 18 years or younger in 2024. And here you have Denis Lavazic on top, who is also in the top 10 in the open leaderboard, but in the juniors category he put in a lot of 9-point scores and higher, giving him a clear edge. So let's look at some additional statistics. Here are the top 15 juniors based on prize money. 7 of them earned at least a little bit or even quite a big amount in 2024, with some best places even winning the tournament. The average score clearly highest for Denis Lazovic. He also has the highest rating with 3,200, participated quite a lot. Only 16-year-old Reza and Artem Bardik participated more. Winning streak-wise, 3 other players were better. And if we go back to the prize money order, we also can look at winning percentage with white. 74% are here the highest values, with black 65%. And the average rating these players defeated is a respectable 2,800 for Denis Lazovic, and in the 2,700s and high 26 for the next 4 players. So quite a promising field of young ambitious newcomers in the chess world. The same exists for girls. Here also 2006 was the cutoff, so 18 years or younger in 2024. And I took the top 15 from that list and added some extra analysis again. So for the girls statistics, there are 2 that get close to an average of 6 points per tournament with a rating above 2,600 already. They did not participate that much, yet were able to establish a winning streak of 5 to 6. So quite comparable to the Grandmasters average. And then we have the winning percentage with white, still below 50%. Somehow Anna Schuckmann is more successful with the black pieces. Same is true for Afrutsa Kamdamova from Uzbekistan, also winning more games with black compared to white. And the average opponent rating they defeat is around 2500, 2450 for the second place. So these are the top below 18-year-old female players in 2024. In the second part of this video, I want to look into tournament-specific results. Some of these will be based around the titles of the players. And when I look into the most common matches in 2024, you will see Josep Martinez again, as well as Hikaru and Magnus. And in the end, there will be some advanced principal component analysis that looks specifically into Grandmaster comparisons. In 2024, there were 53 Tuesdays. So I uploaded 106 files, which represent 106 tournaments. Each date had an early and a late edition of the tournament with different number of players. And on average, the early tournament had 200 more players than the late edition. We could visualize this with a histogram, where you see a clear distinction of almost all of the early tournaments having more players than the late tournaments, with 2 exceptions. And you can also see that it's pretty consistent throughout the year, except for New Year's Eve. You might wonder how many games were played by each player during 2024 and the 106 tournaments. There are some that register to the tournament but then don't play, but it's a rare exception. The overwhelming amount of players actually finish all 11 rounds, and then you have a pretty uniform distribution for the other rounds or games played in total. Some players that play 10 games miss the first one or then quit the last one. We can also ask this in a different way to see how many players participate in each round. And here you see that the most played round is the second one. Some missed the beginning of the tournament, and then it falls off as players decide that they either won't win the tournament or have a good placement in the end, and then they quit. So the last round, number 11, is only played by a bit more than half of the players that started. When I said that most players play all 11 rounds, that's only speaking in relative terms. 45% is not an absolute majority, but still quite high. And then we can ask for each tournament, how often are all 11 games played? As we just saw, 45% is the average, but we can visualize this with a line chart, which shows that in the early tournament, players are a bit more persistent to finish more rounds compared to the late one. And while we are at it, when we compare the ratings for the early and late tournament, then in the early edition, the players are usually a bit more skilled or higher rated compared to the late one. There were only 4 exceptions where the green line is above the red one, showing higher median rating of the players. So these are 53 weeks. This year, I don't spend too much time analyzing the different federations. Here are the top 25 by player number and as a percentage, so most players, relatively speaking, still come from the US, followed by Russia, India, Spain, Poland, Germany, Ukraine. The players in 2024 came from 191 distinct federations, but sometimes they just pick a flag randomly or because they like it and it doesn't really represent their place of birth or the actual federation they compete for. If we focus only on the top 25 most common federations, we can look at the title distribution, so just count how many players from Argentina have these titles, and then we can turn that into a heat map sorted by percentage of grandmasters, and then you see that the US is in the middle with almost 11% of players throughout 2024 being grandmasters. Armenia, Azerbaijan, Hungary, the Netherlands and Iran have above 20-25% of their players being grandmasters. And you see that national masters are not always common for a federation. Sometimes they are just candidate masters. The US has a really high percentage, as does Canada and Brazil. And the most common title overall is the FIDE Master. I want to spend a bit more time on the titles. Here's the percent distribution from all the titles, including the women titles. If we focus just on the top 5 most common titles, we see the distribution throughout the year for early and late events, where you see the FIDE Master title is the most common and that you have a pretty equal distribution. You can also turn this into a box plot where you see that for early or late tournaments, the percentage of grandmasters sometimes varies between 12% up to over 20%, and the proportion of international masters that participate is a bit more narrow, between 15 and 20%, or for the late tournament between 12 and 18%. We can look at the average score these different titles accomplish, and we see the grandmasters achieving 1.5 points more than the international masters on average. Women grandmasters in between the FIDE masters and the candidate masters Masters. If we turn that into a box plot with all the players, you see that from FIDE Master to National Master, the 50% box that includes half of the players overlap quite a bit. International Masters having a slightly higher average score than these three, but then the Grandmasters stand out with a median score above 5 points, something that even the top percentile 25% of other titles hardly achieve, and that can be explained when we look at the average rating of these titles. National Masters, Candidate Masters, pretty similar. FIDE Masters have a median rating of above 2500, which is already better than the top 25% of these other titles, and then you have another jump of International Masters where the average is better than the top 25% of the FIDE Masters, and even more for the Grandmasters, where the lowest 25% are still better than the average International Masters. And then you get these Super Grandmasters that have a blitz rating of 3000 and above. Continuing the analysis of the different titles, we can ask how many points do they score by category. We already plotted the average number of points they make, but here it becomes clear how hard it is to get 9 points and more. Even for Grandmasters, only 8.7% of them achieve that, and for International Masters it's below 1% and almost never happened for FIDE Masters. Even getting 7 points to 8.5 points, not even a majority of Grandmasters achieve that on average, and only 1 in 5 International Masters gets there. In 2024, over 500,000 matches were played in the title Tuesday tournaments, and the most common encounter was Jose Martinez facing Hikaru Nakamura in a total of 16 matches, and he also played 16 matches against Magnus and against Hikaru. He had the black pieces 3 times and lost all of the encounters, and with white he had 13 matches where he won 3, lost 7 and drew 3. Against Magnus Carlsen, he also had the white pieces more often than the black ones, 10 times. With the black pieces, he lost 5 times, but was able to win once. And with the white pieces, he could win half of the games. Here I show the other most common opponents that Jose Martinez faced in 2024. There were quite many that he saw 5 times. For example, Vladimir Kramnik, he beat 5 out of 5 times. Here you can see that against Magnus and Hikaru, which he faced 16 times, the majority he lost. But then other common encounters, he was ahead most of the times, except for Christopher Yu and Milos Spar. We can repeat this chart for Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru, because they are the most successful players, and it's always interesting to look whom they face the most. Not surprisingly, his most common encounter is also Jose Martinez, but then there are other players that he saw more than 10 times, because if you play a lot of tournaments and you get many points, you face the strongest opponents quite often, and he has a big green winning bar against many of them. He's almost never the underdog, except for Magnus Carlsen, where he lost twice as much as he won, and then a big blue bar for draws, so 8 out of 11 encounters ended in a draw. He never lost against Daniel Naroditsky or David Paravan. And then we finished this with the results of Magnus Carlsen. We know that he beat Jose Martinez more often than not, and he faced Nakamura 11 times, but also against Alexander Bortnik. He played 13 times, winning and drawing the majority of cases. He always won against Zigalko and some other players. Only against Alireza Firouzja he did not come out ahead. 1 draw, 3 losses and 3 wins. Seems like he was most happy to beat Alexei Sarana and Dmitry Andrekin, also a very strong player that he never lost against. How common are ties in these kind of tournaments? How often is the score that you achieve to be the first place matched by 1 or more other players, and then the Buchholz cut has to come into play to resolve this? Roughly 49%, half of the cases, you are a single winner. You have the highest score without a competition, but then a quarter of the times 2 players have the same score, and then 15% it happened that 3 players had the same score. Ties with 4 or 5 players were much rarer. You can turn that into a chart and see that the late tournaments had fewer players, so the competition is a bit softer and you win uncontested or with only another player having the same score a bit more often, speaking for the early tournament being a little bit tougher. And also, not surprisingly, with these ties with many players, the actual score for these was 9.5 points. Once you have a perfect score, you're uncontested, and if you have on average 10 points or more, that's the same. 2 players sometimes achieve the same score, That happened once with 10.5 points. Usually it's below 10, and 9.5 is where you get 3 players to tie on average, sometimes with 10 points. That was the maximum score. With this code, we can figure out when exactly these draws with 5 players happened. It was in January, February, and March in the early tournaments. So let's just quickly go through them. In January, 9.5 points was scored by these 5 players. They all played 11 games, and then in the end, the Buchholz cut was applied to make Maxime Legrave the winner. And this score comes from adding up all the points of the opponents that you beat throughout the tournaments, except the lowest opponent. So if you beat a player that ends the tournament with 8 points, that goes into your Buchholz cut. The draw in February saw these players, again very tight Buchholz cut. All players participated throughout 11 rounds and all of them made it into the monies, so they earned some prize money. And then the big draw in March, Alireza Firouzja came out on top with a higher Buchholz cut. I want to end with an advanced analysis where you take multiple variables into account that you suspect to correlate quite a bit. So this is for only the grandmasters. I wanted to know how we can visualize some of the differences. So here are 15 variables that often correlate positively quite a bit. For example, the number of participations and the total games played. The more you compete, the more games you play. Then winning streak is correlated also by how often you play and your average score, but also your rating and so on. And if you have many variables that correlate, you can reduce this complexity and turn 15 variables or 15 dimensions into 2 or 3 or 4 that are still meaningful, that combine some of these highly correlated variables. So here's another visualization of these variables with the correlation score. For grandmasters, the average score mostly depends on how many games they play. And in order to run a PCA, we scale or normalize these different values, then reproduce the results. And you get 15 principal components because we had 15 variables, but we see that the first component already includes more than half of the variation, and with 2 variables we're able to capture 2/3 of all of the variance that goes on with these 15 variables. With 3 and 4 dimensions you capture 77-84% of the variance. You can visualize this with a scree plot where you have this elbow chart that tells you that 1 and 2 variables are kind of enough to capture all of the variance that goes on for these grandmasters. And we can turn that into an interactive plot where we now have 2 dimensions, an x and a y-axis, instead of 15. It shows 2 components, PCE1 with 53% capturing the variance, and then another one capturing 14% of the variance. So most of the differentiation between these grandmasters can be found on the x-axis, and Hikaru Nakamura stands out on top of all of the rest except Magnus Carlsen, a close second. And then there's separation on the y-axis. Here David Howell on the bottom and Mikhail Golubev on the top. So this axis mostly represents how many games were played. You remember David Howell often skipping the first rounds would have a very low average numbers of games per tournament. But what exactly goes into the x and the y-axis, we can see that with the factor loading, which produces this circle, and then you can see that some of these going in the left direction makes sense. If you lose a lot with black and white, then you would be placed more on this side, but then best place and median place is a bit counterintuitive because best place being number 1, lower values in this case represent the opposite. So if your best place is only 80 or 100, you are found here. If it's low, you go in this direction. So most left and right separation happens based on the total prize money, your winning streak, your max score, average score. That's where Hikaru and Magnus shined. Your winning percentage with black and white then also contributes to the y-axis, PC1, the second dimension, and also your overall rating. So some of these grandmasters that were found on top have a lower winning percentage and a lower rating, but they played more tournaments and then participated in most of the games and have a very high total games played. So that's a way to separate these 300 plus grandmasters and then investigate some of these edge cases on the outer barriers to find some interesting patterns and see what makes some of these players unique in their own regard. If you found this analysis interesting, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, ask questions in the comments, or come to my free Skool community to get advice and suggestions on your analysis. See you in the next video here at the Data Digest channel. Bye bye.